Hollow Horned. What's up?
For clarification from your earlier points, do you make a distinction between synthetic truths and physical truths?
So,
like Kant does.
What do you mean by physical truths and synthetic truths?
Synthetic truths are conceptual truthing. Mm-hmm. So, like 1 + 1 is 2, is based on a fundamental reality, like a basis of reality, but does not have a direct connection to it, other than our consciousness being.
Correct. Yes. So there's things that are synthetically true, like necessary truths, like 1 + 1 = 2. The law of non.
So necessary truths are different than synthetic truths, according to Kant.
Yes.
So I'm just making that distinction.
I believe that.
So we're going to make that distinction or not?
Yes, I'm making that distinction. I'm stating that physical truths, that truths for physical things are contingent truths, that which human beings can ground those truths in their mind. But when it comes to necessary truths that have always existed, as long as anything has existed, those would need some type of necessary mind to ground them in.
So synthetic truths are different than necessary truths. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so how are you making a distinction between necessary truths and distinction from anything else, from reality?
So I would say that necessary truths are truths that have always existed.
All right, but how would you separate those two? Like, there has to be a distinction between those two.
Why does there have to be?
A truth of reality that has always been versus a necessary truth that has always been.
So
how would you make that distinction?
Why would we need to make a distinction between that?
Because those are two separate things.
So you're saying that there's a distinction between synthetic truths, completely conceptual truths, and necessary truths?
What the lady that is talking here is referring to, that this lady obviously has academic training, she's referring to this.
He thought the idea of it was one of his most important philosophical discoveries, and a lot of the rest of his philosophy depends on it in one way or another. So I want to give you an explanation of what synthetic a priori knowledge is, and then I'll give you one example of it that was really important for Kant. And then finally, I'm going to explain why Kant thought philosophical or metaphysical knowledge had to be synthetic a priori knowledge. Okay, so the idea of synthetic a priori knowledge is based on two different distinctions. The distinction between a priori knowledge and empirical knowledge, and the distinction between analytic judgments and synthetic judgments. So let's start with the distinction between a priori knowledge and empirical knowledge. Empirical knowledge is any knowledge that comes from or is justified by appeal to the senses. All kinds of everyday knowledge are examples of empirical knowledge. So for example, you know what the weather is like when you look out the window and observe. So that's a kind of empirical knowledge because it depends on the senses. But all kinds of scientific knowledge are also empirical. So for example, if you're close to the surface of the Earth, gravity accelerates objects in free fall at a rate of 9.8 meters per second squared. That's something we only know because it's backed up by a lot of experimental evidence. And those experiments all relied on our senses. So that scientific knowledge is empirical. The opposite of empirical knowledge is a priori knowledge. It's knowledge that isn't justified by appeal to the senses. So for example, think of the truth that all roses are roses. That's a pretty boring truth because it doesn't tell us very much, but it's true. And you know it's true without having to rely on your senses at all because it's just true by definition. So since that truth isn't justified by appeal to the senses, it's a priori. But Kant also thinks math is a priori. So for example, you don't have to do any experiments to confirm, for example, that 7 + 5 = 12. Kant thinks we ultimately justify that truth without appealing to our senses at all.
So, obviously, what Kant describes as a priori is what Khalil refers to necessary. So it's the same thing. They just use different terminologies. Kant describes that as a priori. Khalil names that necessary truths.
So it's an example of a priori knowledge. Now Kant thinks a priori knowledge has a couple of really special characteristics. First, it's necessary. We don't think that 7 + 5 just contingently turns out to equal 12, and it's not an accident that 7 + 5 = 12. We think it's not possible for 7 + 5 to equal anything other than 12, In that sense, 7 plus 5 necessarily equals 12, and Kant thinks the same goes for all a priori knowledge. Second, a priori knowledge is universal. That is, a priori truths like 7 plus 5 equals 12 are true without exception. There's no time and there's no place where 7 plus 5 doesn't equal 12. It's not like there's this one region of space on the other side of the galaxy where 7 plus 5 equals something other than 12. So in that sense, Kant thinks math is universal, and the same goes for all a priori knowledge. These two characteristics of a priori knowledge are important because they give us a kind of test for figuring out if knowledge is a priori or empirical. If knowledge is necessary or universal, then it's a priori. If it's not necessary or universal, then it's empirical. So that's the distinction between a priori and empirical knowledge for Kant. Now let's think about his distinction between analytic judgments and synthetic judgments. Kant says that an analytic judgment is one where the concept of the judgment's predicate is contained in the concept of the judgment's subject. What he means by that is roughly that analytic truths are true by definition. So take the judgment, a bachelor is unmarried. That's analytic, because the concept unmarried is implicitly contained in the concept bachelor. Why? Well, you can think of the concept bachelor as just being made up of the concepts unmarried and man. That is, the definition of the concept bachelor just is unmarried man. In the case of the analytic judgment, a bachelor is unmarried, all the judgment is doing is taking one of the concepts that's already implicitly contained in the concept of bachelor and making it explicit. Synthetic judgments are the opposite of analytic judgments. Kant says judgments are synthetic when they take the concept of the subject and then they connect a new concept to it that wasn't already implicitly contained in it. In other words, synthetic truths are not true by definition. So take the proposition, a bachelor is happy-go-lucky. The concept happy-go-lucky isn't contained in the concept bachelor. It's not part of the definition of bachelor, so that proposition is a synthetic judgment. Kant calls synthetic judgments ampliative, because unlike analytic judgments, they actually connect up new information to the judgment's subject concept that wasn't already contained in it. In that sense, they actually extend our knowledge beyond what was already contained in the definition of the subject.
In other words, Khalil's argument is, premise 1, for a priori knowledge, we necessarily need God. Premise 2, there is a priori knowledge in the universe. Conclusion, therefore, there is God. Simple. That is his argument.
Specific propositions itself, which makes the proposition the truth bearer. So we're already way past where we've already gone through objects, statements, and propositions, and we're at the truth. And now is the crux of the matter is, does truth exist in reality? Not the object, not the statement, not the proposition, the truth. Does that thing that gets laid upon the proposition exist? If you say, no, it does not exist, well, then you could not possibly say anything is true, because something that's non-existent cannot be given properties or cannot hold properties. Obviously, we're placing properties on this proposition, on this truth bearer. So then these truths would either exist physically or conceptually. I don't think that you could show me that they exist physically. The only other option is to say that they exist conceptually.
And the answer is, truth exists in the world because consciousness exists in this world, and truth is a product of consciousness. You claim a priori truths cannot be accounted by consciousness, as it manifests in the universe. Therefore, we need a logos, a God in other words. These necessary a priori truths reflect on. This is what you are claiming. So we have two competing ideas. Socrates' son's hypothesis. Truth doesn't exist without human consciousness. The apparent difference between contingent and necessary truths is because necessary truths reflect the scales in our mind, evolved in an ordered universe, and not directly the environment. Khalil's hypothesis. Truth exists without human consciousness. The apparent difference between contingent and necessary truths is because human consciousness stages only the contingent truths, and God's mind stages necessary truths. So we have two competing hypotheses. Now we need to investigate which hypothesis is true. Premise 1. Reality is everything that exists. Premise 2. Truth is the mental concept that corresponds to reality. Premise 3. Truth is an ontological concept. Conclusion. Even if in a cosmological sense the ultimate reality is the mind of God, still in ontology, truth is related to reality and not to God's mind. Conclusion 2. Necessary truth is not grounded on God, but to reality.
Necessary truths, I would just make.
You said that the third, I'm making a distinction between three things, right? You're saying that the synthetic truth is not necessarily necessary truths, and there's a distinction between synthetic truth and necessary truth. And I'm saying, and you're making a distinction between synthetic truth and reality. So what is the distinction between reality and the necessary truth that you're making?
So the distinction between necessary truths and other synthetic truths other than necessary truths would be something of like a subjective, like it is true that I think that this specific location is beautiful. That would be a subjective truth.
Okay, so now we're talking about subjective truth instead of talking about necessary truth.
Well, you just told me to make the distinction between those, so I just did that for you.
No, I asked you to make a distinction between reality and the necessary truth.
I don't think you
without using
said the word reality.
Yeah, I did. I apologize, but I can rephrase. I wanted to make the distinction between reality and synthetic truth, like Kant does, correct? And okay. You're saying that there is a distinction between those two. And then you're making a third claim, which is that there has to be necessary truths.
Mm-hmm. So
what is the distinction between reality? I'm asking you, like, how are you distinguishing those two specifically?
Well, first we would need to agree on what reality means before we could really make a distinction, because we'd just be talking past each other. So how are you defining reality?
I'm not challenging your definition of reality being the physical reality that we make observations about.
I haven't even defined reality yet.
Not in this conversation, but in this overall concept, yes, you have. But no, so if you want to restate your definition of reality, you're welcome to do so.
Yeah, I just believe reality is that which exists.
First of all, the lady that is talking right now impressed me when I was hearing her, because she's philosophically trained. Okay, I'm just a YouTuber, guys, with attitude. Okay. So I'm trying also to follow what she's saying, because these terminologies. Okay, let's address what it was said right now. What is reality? The distinction of reality with a priori truths, the lady said. Khalil then said reality is everything that exists. I agree with that. We know truth is what corresponds to reality. Reality is not necessarily God in an ontological sense. Okay. Therefore, truth doesn't depend on God. Exactly the same point. We are the same, you and I. The lady that is talking got it. Okay. Got what I said earlier. Okay.
Okay, and I'm not challenging that definition.
Okay, so
again,
make your statement again. Can subjective truths exist in reality?
No, I'm not even. You're the one who brought up subjective truth. My question was, how do you make the claim between necessary truths and reality?
Because truths are values placed on propositions, and reality is that which exists. That's the clear distinction that's made between those two things.
But you're again mixing up synthetic truth with like just an observational physicality. So again, I'm very confused on this because you're making a distinct thing between those three, and you're mixing those three to make it very muddied. So when people ask you about how to make those propositions, you can muddle those lines very, very easily. But in reality is that synthetic truths are very distinct from reality or physical truths, if you want to use that terminology. But then when you bring up the necessary truths, you seem to be able to make that line completely disappear. And I would like to actually ask, why is that line disappearing once you bring that up?
Yeah. So what we're doing here is we're conflating reality as the physical world and that which exists with the truth of the reality does exist. So when we're talking,
so what's the point of using the word truth then?
You're very, very
the way you're using it. Truth doesn't mean anything.
I'm not really appreciating how aggressive you are and how interruptive you are.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. So if we could take it down a notch or two. So what I would say is that I believe that there's a distinction between reality and truth, whether it's synthetic truth, whether it's necessary truth, whether it's subjective truth, because reality is that which exists, and there is a distinction between the physical world and the conceptual world.
That's correct. Reality is what exists. Truth is a mental concept that corresponds to reality. So there is a clear ontological distinction between those two. But included in reality are mental concepts, truth being one of them. So resolving this issue, we need to distinguish between ontology and cosmology. To do that, I propose a different definition of truth. Truth is an accurate description of a given physical reality using sound logic. This secular definition solves the problem. Truth is what corresponds to reality, but reality includes a mental concept called truth. In contrast, if truth is grounded on God's mind, we can only say, in a fundamental level, truth is what corresponds to God's mind, irrespective of any physical reality. Yet we have internally consistent logic that is not true exactly because it doesn't correspond to a physical world. In the evolutionary assumption, even from the state when we were bacteria, we had the ability to detect the environment around us. What if our brain is a highly evolved instrument for detection? Logic reflects the order inside our mind, necessary to detect the order of the environment. And yet, truth is the combination of those two, a functional mental process detecting accurately the environment. That makes perfect sense. Now, what if God came to Earth and said, this elephant can fit through a mouse hole? Is he being true because he said so? No, he's not true unless what? Unless he changes the environment, make the elephant smaller or make the mouse hole bigger, in order for his words to correspond to the environment. Okay, what I'm trying to say is that the environment defines truth, not God.
So I'm not sure what distinction I haven't clearly made between all of these different concepts. I'm just not understanding.
So when Kant usually uses the word synthetic truth specifically, they're usually meaning that conceptually something can be true, not necessarily having any ties to reality, just because the consciousness can be separated in this weird way, where we can conceive something that is not true but make it true conceptually, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but doesn't necessarily have any effect on the reality that we observe.
Doesn't have an effect on the reality. Yeah,
doesn't have an effect on reality?
I don't think it does, no.
Okay, so what we're trying to do is make pure observations about the world without having any distinct contamination with the synthetic reality that we can control, correct?
Yes. Are we simply predicating all of this based off of human observation, though? Because that's where I think we would have an issue.
State that again.
So are we predicating all of this based on human observation, or are we going to say that there's concepts that are mental things that pre-exist human beings? That's mainly
You would have to establish.
to say.
Sure, but you would have to establish that there has to be like an ability to have mental concepts without a subjective like observer of any kind.
Yeah. So then my question to you would be is, do you believe that truth itself exists in reality, whether it's a physical truth, whether it's a necessary truth? If we just were to focus on necessary truths like the laws of logic or 1 + 1 = 2, does that truth itself, does that exist in reality as either a physical or conceptual object?
Okay, so you can't make the distinction between synthetic truths and just reality. That's what you're saying at that point.
No, I'm simply asking you a question.
It didn't sound like a question.
Okay, I'll restate the question. Do you believe that truth is either a conceptual object or a physical object?
Why are you making that distinction?
Because those are the
What is the word truth in that case? Did you not just say that? Like that's kind of the point. Like when you're using the word truth, you're using it in two different contexts, completely different ways, and that's why I'm actually already asking why are you making this distinct? Like how are you making this distinct separation? Why even use the word truth at that point, right? Because you're adding an extra definition onto something that we're trying to clarify.
What's the extra definition?
Truth. You're adding an extra definition of truth specifically.
Yeah, I'm asking
instead of just saying reality specifically. I don't know, but you're adding it specifically just to make it confusing. Like, why would there have to be an extra truth? Like, you're asking, like, what is the truth of reality? When I'm saying, like, okay, let's just talk about reality specifically. We can make sure that if it's quote unquote true, this extra word truth, then what is the point? You yourself acknowledged this earlier when you were talking to the gentleman with the owl for the icon.
Gotcha. Yeah. So what I'm really confused about now is that you're saying that I'm adding a extra definition, and then I ask you what that extra definition is, and you say I don't know. You haven't defined it yet. So how am I adding?
You're using this word truth. Sure. So you're using this word truth as an extra definition to muddy the waters specifically. When I'm actually not even bringing up truth, I'm just making sure that there is a separation between conceptual reality, or how I was using it, synthetic reality, versus just reality in itself. We can make that separation of consciousness and reality specifically, and that you're making that distinction. Fine, that's awesome. But that there can be synthetic truths that are separated from reality specifically. And if we're going to make true, like quote unquote, true observations, or just as observations of reality that is still tainted by subjectivity, but are as clear as we possibly can without our subjectivity, like muddying the waters as much as possible. Like, why would we try to muddy it up with some other like extrajudicial minds considering it?
Yeah, I don't know why you keep going to this statement that I'm trying to muddy the waters. I don't find
because
it
I'm trying
intellectually honest.
I mean, you can call it intellectually dishonest if you want, but the problem is that I'm trying to clarify, and it doesn't seem that that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah. So what I'm specifically putting my laser focus on is synthetic truths, things that are necessary. These necessary truths that exist. We can put all other types of truths to the side and focus specifically on these necessary truths. Do they exist in reality? And if they do, are they conceptual or physical? We don't need to worry about.
So you just said synthetic truths, and you just said the synthetic truth and necessary truths are the same thing. So clarification again. I have to ask: is necessary truth? You just did. I apologize, but that's what I keep on hearing, which is the reason why I have to ask.
Sister, I'm literally recording this on YouTube right now. We can go back.
That's fine. That's great.
So when we're done with this conversation, you can go to my YouTube show.
Oh, I will.
And you could pull this up.
But that's not the point, right?
No, it is the point, because you said that I stated that these synthetic truths and necessary truths are the same thing, which I never said that. I actually stated that synthetic truths, specifically speaking about necessary truths. So I made that distinction. Okay. That's exactly what I did. And if you'd like to go back and show me where I'm wrong, I'd be more than happy to say that I misspoke, but I don't think I did.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, so specifically talking about necessary truths, do they exist in reality? And if they do, are they physical or conceptual objects?
A priori or necessary truths exist. Sorry, I have always a problem with the last S. Exist in reality if the definition of reality is everything that exists, because mental concepts exist in reality. It's not an illusion. Okay, so they exist in reality, and then we need to the timing, the dog game. Are you done now? Sorry about that, guys. Okay, and they exist in reality. And what was the other? And they are conceptual. They are not natural objects. They are conceptual objects. Just so, truth is conceptual only. It's not a natural object. Okay, thank you very much. Let's continue.
I mean, I don't even understand what you're saying by necessary truths.
Things that are always true.
By what standard?
By the standard of possible worlds.
Possible worlds?
Yes. Something that's necessary must exist in all possible worlds.
In all possible worlds, not just the possibility of the reality that we're cohering.
Yeah, that's what makes it necessary.
Okay. So how would you make an observation?
Like right now, I exist in this reality, in this world. There's a possible world to where I don't exist, and the universe can still logically exist, which means that I'm contingent. I'm not a necessary object.
And that's the crux of the argument. If truth exists irrespective of human minds, then God exists. It's very difficult to argue against that. Our contention is that in a world, in a possible world, without contemporary consciousness, there is no truth. This is what we are saying. So we don't agree that truth exists in all possible worlds.
So how do you make an observation of a possible world that you have no ability to actually make any observation towards?
We don't need to make an observation on it. We can just look at it inductively. Logically speaking, we can say that these other worlds, they either need to hold to these specific laws or they do not. So my question would be, if you disagree that, like, for example, the laws of logic are necessary truths that must exist in all possible worlds, can you please conceptualize for me a possible world that does not hold to the law of identity?
Again, you're making, so by that definition, you are not making a distinction between synthetic truths and reality.
But now we're back to this. I specifically stated that we need to focus on these necessary truths. Can you conceptualize
I'm trying to distinct between necessary truths and whatever you're actually saying between that, right? So that's the reason why I brought up, is there a distinction between reality and synthetic truths? Because you're not making the distinction when you're bringing up necessary truths, right? So necessity implies something else specifically, that there has to be an observation that implies that there has to be there. So for instance, Descartes' wonderful statement of I think, therefore I am, because the necessity of the actual, the person making the observation means that there has to be the person that actually is making that observation. That is a necessary truth. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be true. It just means that it's true right here, right now.
No. By definition, in philosophy, a necessary truth is something that exists in all possible worlds. That's the whole entire reason on why we're able to call it necessary, is because it does, in fact, have to exist in all possible worlds.
Which is probably why mass majority of philosophers don't agree with necessary truths the way it's spoken here right now.
I think they do. I think you're mistaken.
They don't. That's the reason why I was bringing up Kant earlier, my dear. Sure. I mean, Kant is the reason why I was bringing it up earlier, is because I was trying to make the distinction between it. Kant actually does disagree with that concept. And so when I was trying to understand where you're coming from, that concept is just completely blown over from mass majority of philosophers that I've studied, at least.
Okay. Yeah. So I agree. I agree with you that Kant did say that. I have studied his work on this, and I do agree that he stated this, but the majority of philosophers, and I would actually say more than the majority, I would say there's a complete universal consensus that when we talk about things that are necessary, there are things that exist in all possible worlds. Now, we can sit here and disagree with that all day long.
Necessary truths are truths that exist in all possible worlds. That's the definition. But are such things as necessary truths? It's difficult to argue that unless you mirror the mind itself. Let's take the law of identity, for example. The law of identity states that each thing is identical with itself. But why is that? Because that is consciousness, not because consciousness defines reality. That is what confuses Khalil. The same way an orange is an orange, the same way consciousness is consciousness. The same way you cannot say because an orange exists, therefore God exists. The same way you cannot say because consciousness exists, therefore God exists. Consciousness is a natural phenomenon. If consciousness could not recognize things, in other words, the law of identity, then it wouldn't have been consciousness. So, in fact, it's not the law of identity, it's just our universe. Inside our universe, there is an evolved quality of biological beings to recognize things. Let's imagine for a moment radical consciousness. That is insanity. It's not consciousness anymore. The fact that the universe is ordered, therefore rationally deductible, and inside our universe there is a biological machine that recognizes this order, that doesn't mean that we need a Platonic truth in some heaven, in some abstract heaven to define the objectivity. Okay, that to me sounds like metaphysical nonsense. Okay, we get to romanticize consciousness because it's our survival tool. We get to think that consciousness, it must be outside of the universe. No, consciousness is just another natural phenomenon.
But I'm still.
I mean, most majority of philosophers nowadays are anti-fundamentalist, which means, or foundationalists.
Sure.
So right there and then you would say that foundationalists are usually people who actually said that there has to be necessary truths.
So here's what I'll do is I'll restate my question one more time. And if you're not comfortable answering it, we can shake hands and walk different ways. If you are comfortable answering it, we can continue the conversation. So when it comes to necessary truths, do they exist physically or conceptually? Which one?
I don't think that there's necessary truths.
Okay. Have a nice day.
Okay. Socrates no. Okay, I'll invite Subaki.
Subaki, you there?
I'll just bring Socrates back.
Yes, hello again. You say that necessary truths are truths in all possible environments. But let's go to the quantum level. In the quantum level, we have counterintuitive things happening. Does the law of non-contradiction, if we exclude minds, in the cosmology, for example, an electron can be in eternal places at the same time. Okay, so you said in all environments. Yet we have in cosmological environments that because nature, the environment is different, how that can relate then to consciousness? You have an evolved consciousness in a Newtonian environment, and then you project this kind of scale consciousness to everything else. Just because your Newtonian evolved mind have certain scales, that doesn't mean that those scales apply in all environments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is my question. And
okay.
Yeah.
So first, I would ask: are you referring to quantum indeterminacy?
Yeah, the counterintuitive quantum qualities.
Okay, and
or even in this world, sir, let's say a triangle. Okay, you say a triangle has three angles, but if you go really close, then you cannot see the three angles. Isn't that right? So what I think you detect when you say the logical absolutes is that just the minds relate a specific meaning to a specific thing, but the environment defines what's true. So I cannot see, and moreover, I cannot. Can you please state a contingent logical, a contingent truth? Because truth is truth. Again, I agree with the lady that just spoke, that how can you make this distinction between truth is truth? Okay, so can you please state a contingent truth, please? What does that mean?
So referring to like triangles are concepts. So I don't think there's going to be in actuality any perfect triangles or any perfect circles or anything like that. I would say that the concept of a triangle are three straight lines with three angles that add up to 180 degrees. So that concept exists, and that concept would be three straight lines and three angles that add up to 180 degrees. My question is with bringing up quantum indeterminacy, is this something that has been observed in reality, or is this a mathematical process that has not yet been observed in reality?
Yes.
And they're still working on it.
In fact, it is observed in reality, yes, with a double slit experiment and many other experiments. Now we know that there are in the quantum level, there are counterintuitive. So let me make a hypothesis. Let's say we go we shrink down to a quantum environment. That means that now our logic doesn't relate to the environment. So although we keep our sanity because our mind is evolved in a Newtonian environment, in the quantum level now, everything we think doesn't relate to the environment. So in a sense, we are insane in this environment because nothing we think correlates to the environment.
Yeah, so speaking on the double slit experiment, real quick, are you stating that the double slit experiment on a quantum level defies the law of non-contradiction?
In the natural world, it defines, but not in our logic, because our logic is evolved in a Newtonian world. So our mind is scaled. But I will demonstrate that if you give me an example of a contingent logic. What is a contingent logic? Because true logic. Because if you, even the contingent logic, for example, if you say an apple is an apple, okay, that's again a true statement.
Yes.
That it's the same in all possible worlds. For example, if I say Mr. Khalil likes ice cream, that statement is true in all possible. It's a necessary.
No, okay, no, that's not a necessary truth. There's a possible world where I could exist to where I do not like ice cream, which means that that's a contingent truth.
Yes, but the statement. Okay, let's pin it down. That's why I'm saying that it's about how our mind pins down concept. For example, I can say, for example, Khalil in this planet likes ice cream vanilla. Okay, that's a true statement. I cannot see how that is different from a necessary statement. So I cannot see this distinction between the necessary with the contingent truth. And I will give the credit to this lady that said that. And as she was speaking, I thought of this. So how can we separate those concepts? What is can you please make a contingent statement of truth which is contingent?
Sure. Yes. Like you just stated one that I like chocolate ice cream. That's a contingent truth, a truth that does not have to be true in all possible worlds. And that's why I was stating the importance of using possible worlds to draw out contingency and necessity. If we are to say that everything has an identity, that would mean that in all possible worlds, would things need to have an identity? Would things need to be themselves and also something, and not something else? So, for example, when I asked her, which she was not able to answer, could you conjure or could you produce some type of world that does not hold to the law of non-contradiction? That means that world could also be not a world. And that just doesn't make any logical sense. So as a necessary truth, the law of non-contradiction must be true in all possible worlds, which is completely different from me liking chocolate ice cream in this world.
Yes, but the law of non-contradiction mirrors our mind. It doesn't mirror. It mirrors the scales of our mind, because we pin down mental concepts to things. For example, you say, I don't like vanilla, or I like vanilla ice cream. Okay, now you say in another world you conflate cosmology with truth. Your scope is very wide, because in order to detect truth, the scope needs to be very, very narrow. For example, if I say in this planet right now, Khalil likes vanilla, okay, that's truth. But if now you say in any possible world, now the scope is very wide, so now you cannot detect truth itself. Now your statement is not truth, because now you widened the scope, therefore now you cannot detect truth. But that doesn't mean there is contingent or necessary truth. Truth is always truth.
Okay, so what I would say is are you familiar with modal logic, which I think you are? I just want to make sure.
That I have heard the definition, but to be absolutely honest, because I'm Greek, I cannot relate to what.
Sure. So let me just briefly explain. So modal logic is logical possibility, logical impossibility, and logical necessity. That states that things that are logically impossible are things that are contradictory. Like if I was to say I'm a human being and also not a human being, that's a logical impossibility. A logical possibility is stating that I like vanilla ice cream. Now, is it logically possible for me to not like vanilla ice cream in another world, or even later in this world? What could I get burnt out on vanilla ice cream and stop liking it? Is that a logical possibility?
Yes, in cosmology, but
even in philosophy, that would be a logical possibility for me to stop liking vanilla ice cream. So that would be a truth that's contingent. It's not necessary. It doesn't need to be there at all times in all possible worlds. Now, if I was to use the same line of logic and say that, is it possible for in this world or in any other world for things to not hold to the law of non-contradiction, what would your answer be?
The law of non-contradiction, no, the law of contradiction will always exist as long as your Newtonian mind, which is scaled, change worlds. Okay, so can you understand now? Now it's very this kind of concepts they are very confusing, obviously. But what I'm trying to say is that when you make ambiguous, when you make the question ambiguous, if we change worlds, is it possible? Yes, but now you widen it the scope. So in order to find truth, we need to then make a further investigation, specify which world then, sir. You will say the third world. Okay, this third world, what you like. So truth relates to something which is, we fix the scope in a way to recognize truth. So personally, I cannot see any distinction between necessary and contingent, although I will have to think of this further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no problem. If you want to just add me, and we can have a further conversation on it.
Of course, sir, and I will see the YouTube video and I will contemplate with what you said further.
Sure.
And okay, thank
All
you very
right.
much, sir.
Not a
Thank
problem.
you.
Have a good day.
Have a good day.
If you want to, Joe, I think there's Brother Jose, and then we'll wrap it up.
Hey, assalamu alaikum. Yeah, I just
So,
I wanted to just make a comment about that one lady who was on the horned. And her name was Horned something.
yeah, just
But
make sure you're respectful.
yeah, I just want to make a correction. She was making like a category error, from what I could understand, because first of all, there's the metaphysical distinction between propositions, which is necessary truth as opposed to contingent truth or proposition.
Mhm.
A contingent truth being that which could have been false, meaning that it's not impossible for it to have been the opposite in some random conception of the world, right? Like your example of the example the other guy gave with Khalilullah likes chocolate ice cream. In some other world, Khalilullah can hate chocolate ice cream, right? And so that's what a contingent truth is, right? And
Let's take two possible worlds. In the first possible world, Khalil likes chocolate ice cream. And 1 + 1 = 2. In the second possible world, Khalil doesn't like chocolate ice cream. 1 + 1 is still 2, though. The necessary versus contingent hypothesis explains that by category. Necessary truths differ from contingent truths. I explained that with a difference in scope. Truth is still truth everywhere. The qualification scope in one case is very wide. The qualification scope in the second is very narrow. My evidence is the statement in the first possible world, Khalil likes chocolate ice cream, now applies in all possible worlds, although doesn't fit Khalil's definition of necessary. Why is that? Because now I qualified the statement in a narrower scope when I included the words in the first possible world. Guys, although I think that in the end this argument will be defeated, if not, I already defeated this argument. What I would like to say, because in my channel I have too much negativity against Muslim apologists. What I'd like to say is that Khalil makes very good arguments. Okay, so he's axios. He's worthy. Okay. I needed to say that. We don't need only to say the negative stuff. Okay, when we see something good, we ought to recognize that. Okay, bravo. Khalil, you are axios. You are worthy. Bravo, my dear sir. Okay, thank you very much.